Alright, let me start off this module by either encouraging you or checking your enthusiasm just a little bit. So if you started off by looking at the length of this video recording, you might be feeling particularly pleased. This video recording is going to be quite short. I don't know the exact time off the top of my head as I'm recording it, but I anticipate that it will be one of our shorter modules so far, because once again we are looking at St. Augustine, and we're going to be wrapping up our survey of Augustine by looking at his magisterial tome, The City of God. Right, so this is the largest of Augustine's works. He writes it over a number of years, even decades, in the final part of his life. And it really is an account of human history and salvation history. So he's got a lot of ground to cover. And so it really is a monumental work in every sense of the word. In talking about the City of God, what we're going to find there is going to draw on and build upon and reinforce many of the themes that we have looked at in Augustine up to this point so far in our course. So, sort of as I did with the discussion of Genesis last time, here too, I don't want to spend your time with necessarily my head talking about what to look for in Augustine again, because you're starting to get a sense of who Augustine is, what he's about, how he works. So I'd rather you spend the time actually reading through Augustine for yourself and just getting a sense of what it is that he is able to do here in this work, The City of God. So that's why this module is going to be fairly short. I just want to talk about a couple of key themes that kind of run through this work, just as a way to give yourself a little orientation, a little map, if you will, of what's going on in the work. But if you happened to look at the readings on Blackboard prior to starting the module, you might be a bit overwhelmed because I intended to provide you just with some key snippets from the City of God. And believe it or not, there are the majority of the books, the 22 books, I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, that make up the City of God. I've only given you selections from a handful of those books, but it is still a very prodigious document that I've uploaded there. So let me begin by saying I in no way anticipate that you will read the entirety of what I have posted on Blackboard. What I have tried to do is to pick out some different passages, some different sections from throughout the work, with an emphasis on thinking about the relationship between human and divine cities and history. And then also, I have quite a bit from the final book or two of the work, because we haven't really touched so much on Augustine's understanding of the resurrection and of heaven. And those are some very interesting and important ideas, so I gave you quite a bit from the very end of the book. But my intention was to give you a very broad sample that you can then kind of thumb through, browse through, and focus on the passages or the sections that are most appealing to you and that you have a particular interest in. Whether it's, he gives an extended account of the miracles that he has heard about happening in his own day, which is very interesting. He has discussions of Roman history and how the Roman virtues led to their great success and Roman vices led to their downfall. And so again, there's all kinds of topics in there. I would encourage you to not read all of it, but instead to browse through it and find those passages that look most interesting to you. You can certainly do this online as well. There are a number of places you can find one of the older translations of the City of God for free online. The New Advent site would be one place to look, but that can be much more difficult to read, both with the on-screen format and with the much older translation. And so I wanted to give you a broad sample from a nice modern translation, again from the New City Press series, that you could browse through and then read at your leisure. And given the size of the document, again, I'd encourage you to wait even to print the document until you've kind of honed in on the parts that you want to focus on, and then you can only print the selected pages that you want to read more carefully. And you could of course always go back and print the remainder of it if you decide to, but I don't want to burn through your printer money your toner money unnecessarily. So please do take that seriously. Don't read all of it. Focus on the selections that you find most interesting. Okay, given that hopefully reassuring caveat about the reading, and having promised that this module is going to be short to free up some time to do more of that reading, we should probably cut to the chase and talk about the city of God. And as I mentioned, right, this is a book that Augustine writes over a long span of years. And he is, again, attempting to lay out a sort of comprehensive account of human and divine history. Now, even with a work this big and this monumental, it is important to step back and ask some of those basic questions about how do we interpret a text. So what is it that is Augustine's aim? Why is he writing this work, right? And even Augustine, with his obvious penchant for writing about things, he has a huge written corpus by the end of his life. He doesn't just do this because it sounds interesting, right? That Augustine is dealing with some very specific problems that lead him to undertake this work in the city of God. Now, what you'll see as you even look through the very select selections I give you is that Augustine also can't kind of help himself. So that when he is writing about one particular topic, whether he's going through, say, Old Testament history, giving account of all the different patriarchs and kings, he will go off on these discursus or these tangents where some topic will come up related to it. He just can't help himself, and he has to talk about it for a few pages before coming back to his primary argument for that section. So there is some playing going on here. There is Augustine just enjoying talking about all kinds of different interrelated topics. But the key thing that is prompting all of this, it is what's going on in Augustine's own day. Right? Again, Augustine is writing out of the living experience of his church, out of the living, or to address the real concerns of the people in his church, and that's what's going on here. Right? In Augustine's day, as we've mentioned before, the Roman Empire is struggling. And in fact, in the very final years of Augustine's life, the barbarians are literally at the gates. When Augustine dies, Hippo is under siege from barbarian invasion. Rome has already been sacked, right? Rome has been defeated in battle and sacked by barbarians. And Christian citizens obviously have been part of this, right? So that there have been people killed, there have been rapes, there has been pillaging, all kinds of the horrors that make up war have been going on, right? And so the people that Augustine is writing to in his community and the broader church are experiencing real disasters, real crises in their daily lives. And so Augustine is trying to address this. Now, if you step back for a moment and look at this in the context of the broader theological issues, this raises some problems. If you recall from our discussion of Athanasius, one of Athanasius's arguments for Christianity was the fact that Christianity was succeeding, right? That Christianity was spreading, and that things were going well, right? That there were good, positive benefits of the spread of Christianity, right? So the downfall of the Roman Empire during Augustine's day raises some questions, right? And many of the lingering pagans who are in the society are going to be arguing that the reason for all these struggles that Rome is going through is because the traditional gods have been abandoned and people have adopted Christianity. And so Christianity has undermined the empire, either because the gods have turned against Rome and are punishing them for their infidelity, or on a maybe more sophisticated level, many of the pagans or many critics of Christianity might argue that this isn't because Jupiter is smiting Rome for turning away from him, but that Christian virtues, Christian values have weakened Rome, have made it soft, right? So that Rome has lost the kind of authoritarian, militaristic ethos that made it the power that it was, and that these pacifists turn the other cheek kind of Christians are in fact leading to the downfall of Rome. So Augustine needs to address these concerns. He needs to address and explain why these things are happening, to give an account for why God would allow these things to occur in history, So that's one of the main things he is doing here in this book. Now to do that, he's gonna trace a long span of human history and to show where the Roman Empire and where the church fall in that span of history. He's also going to look ahead to the ultimate end, both to kind of complete the picture, but also because when people are suffering through the difficulties that they are going through in Augustine's time, it is helpful to have the anticipation of better days to come. And so Augustine spends quite a bit of time talking about what the resurrection might be like, what heaven might be like ultimately as well. So that's kind of Augustine's motivation and his main thesis, if you will, is to explain how all of this actually fits into God's plan and how it reflects the truth of Christianity rather than the problems that Rome is experiencing being an indication of the weakness of Christian belief and practice. So that's kind of the big picture. Now, it's called the City of God, right? And so, again, just to give you an overall sense of what's going on in the text, Augustine does this, he makes his argument by plotting these parallel paths, if you will. So he talks about the City of God, which is made up of the people of God living out their lives here on earth, and then ultimately, of course, going to heaven. Now, he doesn't necessarily equate the church at any particular time with the City of God, right? So when we talk about the City of God and the City of Man in the work, the City of God does not equal the church, right? Because Augustine, drawing on the Gospels and many other obvious sources, recognizes that the physical makeup of the membership of the church at one particular time is not necessarily equivalent to God's people, right? That there is going to be a mixture within the church of those who are truly part of the City of God and those who aren't. So it's not so easy to just saying church and state, although obviously there is some sense of that going on in these two cities, right? And so in the City of God, he talks about God's plan, God's relationship with us, stretching all the way from Adam through Christ, through all the biblical history, into the church age, and then ultimately what is going to happen in the resurrection. And then, of course, Augustine also says, running through all of this time as well, we have the City of Man, right? We have human kingdoms, human cities, human nations, and empires that come along, that rise and develop, and that fall. And so Augustine talks about that and how these two things kind of run in parallel. And of course, there are conflicts between them, which he discusses as well. When he talks about the City of Man, again, he is going to see it's certainly in some ways the lesser of the two cities, right? That the real story, if you will, is ultimately going to be the City of God and the city of the heavenly city, ultimately. But again, one of the things that you see here in this work, as we've seen all through Augustine, is that while he can be critical of bodily reality, bodily history, he's also not going to go so far as to be a dualist, right? So he does see a real value, and there can even be goodness in the City of Man, right? And so one of the things that he's going to argue for in the course of the work is that the rise and fall of empires, the good and bad that happens, is related to the virtue or vice that one finds in these particular cities, right? So when he looks at an account of Rome, rather than explaining their success being due to the influence of the gods, or their success being due to their kind of brutal militaristic power, Augustine is going to argue that Rome's ascent, Rome's power and success is due to the extent that they are practicing the true virtues, right? And so, correspondingly, he would argue that ultimately the problems that Rome experiences are not because the Christian God is too weak or that Christianity has undermined the principles that made Rome strong. Rather, it is sin, it is evil and wickedness within Roman practice, within the Roman state, that has caused the problems that Rome experiences. And he's going to encourage his Christian audience to look at all of this and see it as exemplary, right? That the pride, ultimately, of Rome, Rome's lavish living and all of those things are what have led to its downfall, right? And so his Christian audience should take a lesson from all of this and make sure that they don't experience those sufferings because they fall into the same sins. But again, he's not completely critical of the city of man, right? The city of man is established by God, just like God makes the physical creation in Genesis. Having human civilizations, human cities, human nations is part of God's plan, although of course it has been corrupted by sin, like everything else. And so we see the effects of that sin scattered throughout the course of human history. And so having a sense of how all of these stories fit together, the story of the city of man, the story of the city of God, and how the two mesh together, that's one of really the main purposes for Augustine writing this work. The other thing I think, sort of a more practical takeaway that Augustine would want his readers to have is to give an explanation of how these things ought to work, right? How the city of man ought to function, how the relationship ought to be between the city of God and the city of man, right? And so one of the things, again, that we see here that I think that's interesting in Augustine is that he is not, for all of the draw that the kind of Neoplatonic view of things might have for him, as much as he might be influenced by this more spiritual, mystical way of looking at the world, he also remains kind of very realistic and committed to the goodness of concrete historical material reality, right? And so for him, the ideal is not an escape from the city of man, right? It is to arrange and order things in this life, in the city of man, as well as they can be, right? And that's really kind of the goal when we look at what Augustine is encouraging his readers to aim for. What he thinks the way things ought to be is a kind of a benevolent ordering of things, right? So he will talk about how within individual lives that we ought to order our passions, we ought to order our desires so that we have a good life overall and we aren't led astray by these things. But the same thing is true on a larger scale in a family, right? That a family ought to be ordered in such a way that excesses are avoided and that there is a good benevolent order imposed, which in Augustine's time can even include the use of force within the family, right? So a Roman father, a pater familias, has authority within his family, not only over his children, but also in this period over his wife, and over extended relatives, servants, slaves, a much larger household in some cases. That authority is going to include the ability to use physical force to maintain control. Now what Augustine will do, in contrast to say the Roman model where a pater familias has absolute right of life and death over any member of his household, Augustine is going to urge that this be all done benevolently, right? That you ought to use any coercive force that you're going to use out of love and to promote the good of the other person. So he's certainly not going to seem ideal on these issues from our modern perspective. He certainly would not be seen as recognizing the equality of women in the way that we would today, and you can see that from some of the selections I give you. But he is trying to at least mitigate some of the authoritarian nature, some of the sexism that you find in traditional Roman practices, right? And the same is true then on the larger scale of moving from the individual to the family and moving then to the city or the state. And there too, Augustine is going to be something of a realist, right? So he doesn't think that Christians ought to be pacifist. He doesn't think that Rome ought to abandon its military power. He does think that Rome has brought some of its problems about by the desire for conquest, rather than using force simply to pursue justice or to prevent wrongdoing. But he does think that there is a proper role for the military, for coercive force on the part of the state. And so again, you can see that in a number of the selections I'll have you look at. But unlike the desire for glory and power and money that has driven that in the past, and particularly in the case of Rome, Augustine says this ought to be driven out of a love of the other, out of a pursuit of justice, and that we always do it for the good of others, for the good of the whole community. And so it's a very different understanding of the relationship between church and state in some ways, because it is a very different time. But Augustine is, I think, very much worth reading on these topics, because he is still striking this balance that we still struggle with today in terms of how ought we to live out our Christian ideals while still recognizing that we live in this fallen world, and that we aren't going to have sort of the heavenly experience here in this life. So what's the best way to produce the best earthly city that we can? And so I think reading how Augustine works through that, it can be very helpful, even in thinking about our own political relationships or our own political arrangements here and now. So those are some of the key things running through the work, but as you're going to see, there's a whole host of topics that get treated in laying out this huge picture of the earthly and heavenly cities. So again, please don't read all of it. Please take your time, browse through it on your computer, pick the parts that you want to read, print those out if you want to, read those. And then again, hopefully once you get into your discussion groups, we'll find that people have selected different things. There will be a chance to get a sense of more of the readings from reading your fellow students' comments and going back and forth on Blackboard. So I will be interested in getting your perspective on this. It's been great for me to go back through some of these things in the City of God as well, and I look forward to talking with you about all of this on Blackboard.